In the first two parts, we looked into the technicalities on how to look at fertility and demographics, then at mythology, then at who says what and how this is perceived in the real world, and then at the tyranny of small decisions, which eventually leads to ideas, thought patterns, and practices that end up having a depressing effect on fertility, regardless of the initial intent behind them. Throughout the series so far, I bashed the pro-natalists quite a bit more than antinatalists, but not because they necessarily deserve it more, but because I trust nobody in this esteemed audience is an antinatalist. There's really not much to be said about how crazy the antinatalist position is. Now, in this episode we'll look into policy, but not before setting out some principles. You see, most people are neither antinatalists nor pro-natalists, so successful policy has to devise the incentives that work for most people, not what tickles the fantasies of advocates. Antinatalists don't win the information war with obscure and, dare I say, autistic philosophical gobbledygook about how reproduction is torture. They win the information war by appealing to fertility depressing incentives. Similarly, if pro-natalists want to start winning in both policy and information warfare, they will have to learn to lean on fertility enhancing incentives rather than autistic diatribes that appeal to an online audience. So with that, let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the third and final installment of the demographics series here on the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this discussion was framed more or less as a summary of the thousands, if not tens of thousands of discussions I've had with pro-natalists. So after explaining the technicalities and why most of the common pro-natalist tropes are either straight up false or they just don't work, the common flow usually ends with the pro-natalist accepting most of the critique, but then asking, okay, but how would you do things? The trouble with that question is that it ignores most of the conversation. You see, fertility is still ultimately an individual question. And because this is true, no authoritarian type of measures ever worked for long enough. And nearly everything you can imagine has already been tried somewhere throughout history. That's why the question, how would you do things, is a lot more complicated than what people who've spent too much time online would like to think. Also, do keep in mind that the vast majority of the populace does not believe there is a fertility problem to begin with. And sure, you can argue that they're wrong, but you still have to convince some of them. And you also have to convince your side of the argument to live up to their own book of rules. Because again, as unfair as it may be, a pro-natalist that has less than 3 children is ipso facto less credible on this issue. And that is a good thing. So with that in mind, I'll try to respond to the question, but also add some more context. So, Chapter 1, the biology and inertia hypotheses. Now, as I alluded in the previous 2 episodes, almost nobody wants to look or even try to look anywhere else except materialism. This is in part due to the pervasive materialist bias that has been permeating nearly all discussions. But another reason for the resistance to looking somewhere else is fear that the conclusion may indeed be that there isn't much to do at all at the macro level, or even worse, that there really isn't any problem to begin with. In fact, if we take biology seriously enough and account for demographic inertia, the conclusion that there really isn't a big problem and we're just reverting to the mean is almost unavoidable. So here's the hypothesis. Humans actually rarely want more than 3 children. And even 3 is pretty rare. But for most of history, ending up with 3 children required a lot more attempts due to very high childhood mortality. Until about 2 centuries ago, 1 in 2 children died before reaching puberty, with some periods and places going even higher than that, as this graph shows us. This fact is routinely used to push all sorts of agendas and falsehoods, such as the falsehood that 60-year-olds were very rare in the 1800s, which is of course nonsense. Someone who reached age 40 in the 17th century had a good chance of reaching age 60 as well. Surviving till puberty was the hardest part. Now, given that it's just been 200 years since infant mortality hasn't been that high, it stands to reason that as humans we developed the habit of trying harder in order to achieve our goals. However, while things have changed in the survival area, our wishes haven't changed that dramatically. We still want mostly 2 or 3 children and routinely less than that. It's only that today we can afford to have 2 and reasonably expect both to survive and live long, so we've slowly adapted to no longer having 6 in the hope that 2 or 3 survive long enough. But this adaptation to this new reality takes a while. And how do we adapt? Well, we look around. In 1724, you would look around and saw that your neighbors had 5 kids and only 2 survived long enough to play with you by age 10. And you yourself are the 6th sibling, but only your brother is still alive and the youngest is kinda sick in the barn, and everyone kinda seems pretty content that he may not make it. So, based on that experience, when it's your turn, you try for 6 as well, hoping that 2 or 3 survive. But then by that time you get 6 out of which 4 survive. Not quite ideal, but you're happy to have seen less death. But when it's your kids' turn, they may aim for 4 or 5, hoping 2 or 3 survive. All of this process is very slow and the aggregate decisions take a long time to be noticeable. And the processes have also been made even longer from 1800 onwards as more people lived longer. So the accumulation of wisdom improved, but the practical outcomes of that wisdom were also delayed. So, if we scale this on a wider timeline, starting from the middle of the 18th century, assuming a generation is 20 years and accounting for inertia, it kind of looks like this. The first generation has 10 kids, so that at least 3 survive. Second one does the same, but 4 end up living. Third also does the same, but 8 end up surviving till puberty. By this point, the 4th generation aims for 8 kids because it figured it out that they no longer need to aim to 10. 6 of them end up living. The next one, the 5th generation, does the same. By this time, we're in the middle of the 19th century. So the 6th generation aims for 5. In some places, quite often all 5 of them end up living, and this scars the kids. So they, as the 7th generation, aims for 3, and again, most of the time, all 3 end up living. So when it's their turn, as the 8th generation, they aim for 2 or 3. And this is where the decline starts. This is where Africa is today and where Europe was in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Then the 9th generation does the same, aims for mostly 2. This accentuates the decline, although this time it's not infant mortality that depresses the numbers, but other choices. When people no longer aim for 10 kids, they start thinking about it later, and some of them end up trying later. This is the phase where the decline becomes sharp, and this is where Europe is right now. The 10th generation goes for maximum 1. Here the decline reaches critical phase. This is where China is right now, with hundreds of millions of young people purposefully choosing to have 0 kids or maybe 1. The next one, the 11th in my table, copes with this new reality, hastily tries to have 3 kids as the norm and mostly fails. This is the immediate future of China no matter what. Because remember, inertia is a bitch. Then the next one, the 12th here, gets a bit more serious if the context is advantageous. This is where Central Asia is. Remember, Kazakhstan was at 1.5 just 20 years ago. A generation ago, that is. So, studying how they did this is, in my view, crucial. I'm not saying they're the only ones who are right, but I am saying that if you regard this as a problem, studying those who managed to turn things around is the logical thing to do. And finally, the 13th generation in this table reassesses the result from the above and starts adjusting to the new conditions. This is the step where the rebalancing and stabilization of total fertility rates begins. The first ones to be here will undoubtedly be Central Asia in 2040 to 2045. all of this is valid under the assumptions that humans overwhelmingly desire mostly 2 kids, and the last 200 years have been disrupting the reproduction patterns, and the inertia is finally catching up with these disruptors. In other words, the future is not bleak, but just a reversion to the mean in accordance to the preferences which have remained roughly unchanged for centuries or even more. Now, there are a few problems with my analysis. For starters, it's next to impossible to find reliable data on the actual size of median families in, let's say, 1600s. There are some clues, though. The BBC, for instance, tells us that the Black Death, which hit Europe in late 1340s, had a significant impact on household sizes. Before the Black Death, the average household size was approximately 5, whereas afterwards it was less than 4. Then there's this study which tells us that, quote, the mean household size in England and Wales as a whole was relatively constant at 4.75 or a little below for the whole period from the 16th century until the 19th century and has only fallen since that date, unquote. Then I found something really interesting in a huge book published by the Romanian National Institute. So here's the graph with the birth and death rate counted per 1,000 inhabitants from 1859 to 1932. Now, here's a table of the birth rate, also counted by 1,000 per 1,000 inhabitants in Transylvania. Notice one is decreasing. The actual life conditions between the two weren't different. The majority were still the same people. The only difference was that Romania at the time had been through a war in 1877-78, and there was an uptick in mortality due to it, and then a corresponding uptick in birth rate afterwards, as it's quite common after wars, historically speaking. Translation. Transylvania followed the pattern that I described, namely that the next generation looked at increasing survivability and aimed for fewer kids for the same result, while the rest of Romania had the disruptor, namely the Russo-Turkish War, so that inertia was postponed. Now, there are many other such disparate facts that seem to support my hypothesis. However, I haven't done an extensive global study to see how consistent this is. Such a study would require a year or two of working just on this, and I honestly don't have the time to do that for free. The trouble is that pro-natalists are uninterested in this because the potential conclusion may very well be that my hypothesis is at least in part true, and therefore the whole agitation about the demographic crisis is a red herring. That is to say, there is no demographic crisis per se, but a crisis of socialism that is caused by demographics doing what demographics always do, which is to revert to the mean after heavy disruptions. Heck, I could even go on a personal anecdote here. I'm from a family of mostly intellectuals, merchants, and priests. I can trace my family tree till somewhere in the middle of the 18th century. All but one of the families that preceded me had fewer than 3 children. Quite a few, only 1, even in the 19th century. The point being that those who could afford to avoid the common ills that brought the high childhood mortality would straight up aim for 2 or 3, even 200 years ago, even 300 years ago. In fact, if you take any country for which there is statistical data on the total fertility rate from the 18th or 19th century, and you normalize that data with the infant mortality rate, that is to say, you subtract the infant mortality rate and thus account not just for how many kids a woman would have in her fertile lifetime, but also how many of them would survive, at least till puberty, you'll suddenly notice that what we care about, namely how many kids reach adulthood, that rate wasn't significantly higher than today, and in some places, like France, it was routinely lower or much lower. This also makes sense intuitively. We wouldn't have grown our populations that fast in just a century without somehow having more kids reaching adulthood, even though we're having fewer of them. Seems pretty obvious. Then there are also less obvious facts that should incentivize anyone serious about this to look more into the biology aspect. For instance, On a quick Google search, you will find out that 105 boys are born for every 100 girls. And because men die earlier, that's why a lot of countries on Earth, though by no means all of them, have slightly more women overall in them. This is true, but only on average. If you inquire further, you will be told that only artificial interventions, such as China's one-child policy or the higher migration rates of men, or more extremely genocide, can explain any variation from this general trend. Now again, all of that is true, on average. But as it turns out, there actually are situations and places where the 105 boys for every 100 girls is not the norm and not exactly the result of genocide or harsh policy or migration either. It turns out that the age of the father can change this. In a study in Denmark, it was found that 51.6% of children born to fathers younger than 25 were male, whereas 51.6% of children born to fathers over 40 were female. So, as the age in which people have their first child increases, the male-to-female ratio may also increase. And guess what? In most industrialized countries, that ratio has been increasing for decades already. To make things more complicated, it also varies by country or even by ethnic group within the country. In Europe, for instance, the male-to-female ratio at birth is 1.04 in Belgium, but 1.07 in Southern Europe. In my country, it was 1.03 in the 1990s, but now it's 1.04. In Africa, the median is 1.03, which means there are quite a few countries where it's lower than that, such as Rwanda, where it is allegedly 1.01. But is that because of poor statistics collection methodology, or is it yet another consequence of the 1994 genocide? Or maybe it's something else, like the harsh environment. Who knows? Nobody is curious. Not even pro-natalists, who are also concerned about the quality of new births, not just having more births in general, not even they are concerned with understanding how these things work. Now, I could speculate on why, but that's way outside of the purpose of this series. Alright, then there is the issue that there may be a different biological explanation. Now, this is pure speculation on my part. But just like we discovered epigenetics, what if there is some other biological mechanism that limits our reproduction past a certain threshold? I'm not saying there is one, but has anyone looked? Because when a phenomenon occurs almost simultaneously and with remarkable consistency throughout the world, it stands to reason that to at least suspect that some biological factor may be at play. In this particular case, this may not be true, but can it be ruled out for now? The point of this chapter, in addition to putting out my hypothesis, is to caution one more time about how much we don't know about this topic and why we must continue to be humble whenever we discuss fertility and demographics. Unfortunately, this will fall on deaf ears for at least another half a decade. We really need to wait out for the age of crazy to just pass. And it will, eventually, just not this year. Alrighty. Chapter 2. Principles and limits. Now, in order to propose any policy, we must first understand the limits and at least somewhat agree on principles. Or if we don't agree on principles, at the very least be aware of the differences that exist. I alluded to most of this in the series, but it needs to be spelled out clearly. So, the limits of policy on demographics are as follows, and keep in mind, most of this applies to any policy, not just demographics. 1. You may end up making things worse. Being aware of this should help one devise policy that tries to avoid this. Ceausescu's pro-natalist regime increased the total fertility rate, but also increased the childhood mortality rate, the incidence of disabilities, the incidence of poverty, and left a legacy of all sorts of downstream harms of which my country isn't fully cured of to this day, because inertia is real. 2. This is not an economic matter. I think I gave enough examples to justify this, but I will reiterate, if the goal of your policy is to get more children, approaching it through a purely materialistic and economic lens is a waste of time and money. Not only it doesn't work, but it also has unintended consequences, like creating resentment in society. We see this on a huge scale in China. The slogan "Lost Generation" has a different meaning in China than in Europe. 3. You don't know what you don't know. And again, I think I explained this enough, but it's worth reiterating. It may very well be the case that the data you're looking at is wrong, maybe even entirely wrong. Treading cautiously is very well advised. Devising policy by taking the total fertility rate of the 1950s as the baseline looks entirely different from devising policy by taking the current one as a baseline. What I'm saying here is that policy should try to meet people where they are if there's any chance of any policy to ever work. Even then, it may still fail, but the trade-offs will be less severe than by not meeting people where they are, like Deng Xiaoping or Ceausescu did. Basically, what I'm saying is to always ask, compared to what? And the fourth limit, the de facto sunset clause. Now, what I mean by this is that any policy eventually becomes a drag, either because the enforcer, let's say the government, or in the past the church, becomes tired or distracted, or because the plebs decide it's no longer worth it. In Roman law, which forms the basis of law for the overwhelming majority of the planet, there is even an explicit provision for this. It's called legislation having fallen into desuetude. Over time, courts have assimilated people refusing to abide by a policy, especially an administrative one, as being one and the same with the policy not being enforced, and thus having fallen into desuetude. In common law, or Anglo-Saxon law, this reality was codified by having sunset clauses to policies and laws. But over the last 100 years, the Anglo world has slowly been forgetting this. Fewer and fewer laws have sunset clauses anymore. This is dangerous if the courts can't repeal laws based on desuetude. But anyway, that's a story for another day. For the purposes of this series, this limitation has to be kept in mind. You can only keep the attention of the public with a fertility policy for so long, usually no more than 20 years. Eventually, they'll stop giving a damn en masse. We've seen this happening time and time again. Ceausescu was concerned with the fertility rate, but 20 years after the 770 decree, the fertility rate was in fact lower than prior to the implementation of the policy. In under 10 years, people found workarounds and imposed their will. Same goes with incentives or propaganda. For instance, in Denmark, they had the Do It for Denmark campaign 10 years ago. Anglos derided the campaign as invoking age-related and gendered stereotypes and for carrying explicit heteronormative and ageist tones that reflect pro-natal and youth-oriented culture, as if that's a bad thing. The Danes, to their credit, ignored the whiners and went through with it, and the campaign did have an effect. But its effect waned in 5 years. Same goes with the natal socialist policies in places like Hungary or Poland. Rodzina 500 Plus, the pro-family program introduced 8 years ago, did have an effect, albeit a marginal one, but by 2024 its effect is now gone. The total fertility rate of Poland is now at the same level as 2013, 3 years before the program. And so this is a hard limit. Your policy has to take into account this, that there is a de facto sunset clause. All right, now some principles. 1. Inertia is real. Any policy on demographics has to keep in mind that population momentum is a thing. So, on logistics, if you want to build schools, you look at how many kids were born last year. Deduct normal mortality and migration, and you know roughly how many school spots you need 7 to 10 years from now. Similarly, if you want to build facilities for infants expecting a sharp increase in births, you do have to also take into account that that sharp increase will not be sustained for too long. This is true outside of logistics as well. If you want to do propaganda, be realistic about its potential effects when establishing the goals. Set out an unrealistic goal and you'll find out pretty fast what a waste of time your efforts were. 2. Biology and history are real. I know this sounds redundant, but it needs to be said repeatedly. If you want to do pro-natalist policy, you must immediately abandon the dogshit biology denialist ideologies like egalitarianism and feminism. You'll be called a sexist for that, and that's fine. Fertility is sexist. Tough luck. And because history is real, try to avoid the mistakes of the past whenever possible. That is to say, don't go full Ceausescu or Islamic Republic of Iran. In the long run, that makes things worse overall, but also makes fertility worse, as evidenced by history. 3. Consent of the governed matters. When it comes to the fertility policy, consent of the governed matters no matter the regime. Communism, theocracy, authoritarianism, democracy, republic, doesn't matter. If you can't convince at least a significant minority of your populace to go through with your project, your policies will fail. Because fertility is still, at the end of the day, an individual thing. Unless, of course, you want to get into forced reproduction factories and other weird shit like that, in which case you are on the wrong channel. And finally, 4th principle, everything makes sense in context. And what I mean by that is that while failure of policy seems to be pretty consistent across geography and cultures, success may not be so consistent. Case in point. When the Patriarch of Georgia announced that he will personally baptize every child that is 3rd or more in the family, the total fertility rate saw a bump. Since 2008, Patriarch Ilya has baptized almost 50,000 children. When that same policy was floated in other places, such as Ukraine, it had no effect. Sure, we can speculate on why, and I certainly have my ideas about it, but the point is that simply copying successful policy from somewhere else, even a culturally similar nation, is no guarantee of success. Alright, and now on to what too many have been waiting. Chapter 3, Policy. Now, to keep this video short, I most definitely won't present here a policy paper, but if there is a pro-natalist lobbyist who needs that, we can definitely arrange something. So, with that said, let's start with the beginning. Number 1, managing the current momentum. This one should concern everyone, antinatalists, pro-natalists, and indifferents like me. About 100 countries on Earth have a current population momentum that inevitably leads to some serious economic disruption. This is already baked into the cake. There is nothing you can change about this, and the phenomenon cannot be prevented. But how you manage it is a policy decision. Some countries try to convince as many old people as possible to get euthanasia. I think that's anti-human and morally reprehensible, but I'm also not surprised it's happening. Anti-human societies inevitably adopt anti-human policies. But the thing is that this won't work in big enough numbers in most countries. And the elephant in the room is the Ponzi scheme of the state pension system, or Social Security. That shit is unsustainable, and it's the chickens coming home to roost on a policy that was bad right from the get-go. Now, realistically, few governments will be willing to openly admit this. So what they'll do is gradually increase the legal age of retirement, and this will happen everywhere, and there is no reason to hope it won't. Which is why I openly advise anyone, and especially those under the age of 45, to automatically refuse to contribute into the system. You will not benefit from it. That is a guarantee, no matter what the politicians are telling you. They're full of it, and they know it. And please be reminded that most politicians of today will be long dead by the time you reach your legal age of retirement, especially if you're under 45 now. The moderate policy here is to do a combination of what Czechia and Portugal have been doing. Czechia even managed to convince old people to work more, which is quite impressive, but I doubt is replicable in too many other places. But what Portugal has been able to get away with is nothing short of impressive. For starters, the pensions in Portugal are in fact very low. The median pension in Portugal is around 680 euros, but the statistics is misleading because it includes foreign pensioners who retired there but whose pensions are only managed by the Portuguese state but not paid by the Portuguese government. Also, of those 680 euros, at least 200 are sometimes not paid. Under the supposedly temporary measures introduced in 2009 with the Eurozone crisis, a lot of state pensions have been partially paid in IOUs, or government bonds, routinely redeemable long after the pensioner is dead. Of course, you won't find a lot about this in the press. Some of those measures expired in 2020, so surprise, surprise, now Portugal has ramped up the taxes on the pensions of foreigners. Again, you won't find much about this in the press either, and certainly no whining from the European Commission that this breaks the freedom of movement and capital. But where Portugal goes, it's well, all others will go as well. There is, in fact, a competition now on who taxes foreign pensions less. Everyone forgot already that merely 15 years ago, the very idea of taxing pensions was anathema. The fact that there are too many, there is just the fact that there are too many entitled pensioners, and this will necessarily get worse. And in fact, pro-natalists will necessarily have to essentially assume the position of more or less fuck old people. I'm not joking. Because if you want to convince young people to have more children, the last thing you want to is increase their taxes to support the much more numerous old. So from a pro-natalist perspective, what Portugal and Czechia are doing is correct, but also moderate. That is to say, they're not going far enough. If it were up to me, I would ramp up the efforts to intentionally shrink state pensions, in addition to more propaganda aimed at demonizing old people and getting the rest of society accustomed to the idea that the state genuinely doesn't give a shit what happens to you after you retire. But then again, my policy goal would be to retire the state pension system itself. Incidentally, my policy goal would also be structurally pro-natalist, at least in part. But most governments won't do that, at least not at first. What they will do at first is steal or nationalize any and all private pension funds, starting with the regulated ones like the Betriebsrente in Germany, or the second pillar, as they're called in Romania. When that won't be enough, and it won't be, then the purely private ones will suffer a haircut. Now you think that's impossible? Well, ask the Cypriots what happened to their savings accounts when the European Commission needed money. If you think your money is safe in the bank, you are delusional. When the economic effects of demographics will create enough panic in the government, that's when you will learn how safe your money is in the bank. Please don't say I didn't warn you. So yeah, this is the first policy directive. Manage the current momentum in such a way that is not structurally antinatalist. So, no new taxes on young people. Number 2, status for parenthood. Now, unfortunately, this one is trickier, but as I said, fertility is not in itself an economic issue and does not have a direct economic fix. Throwing money directly at it just doesn't work. Fertility and parenthood are a lot more connected to status and other subjective things like mood and feelings. And the current economic model downgrades parents. That's just reality. It wasn't always like that, but in an attempt to enact the fiction that men and women are interchangeable, too many societies have enacted policies aimed at protecting women from so-called career harm due to pregnancy. Also in the process, a lot of societies tried to make it illegal for employers to inquire about the employees' children, which resulted in the cancellation of fathers' bonuses as well. I'm sure this comes as a shock to you, but overall none of this worked. Women's career harm wasn't significantly diminished, while families' overall income was diminished since the fathers no longer get a bonus for being fathers. And why would it work? The basic assumption is insane. Men and women are not interchangeable. They never have been. In the Soviet and communist world, we tried to have them both, the fiction of egalitarianism and status for motherhood. The state would award the title to mothers who raised a certain number of children. In the USSR, it was called Matgeroina and was given to women who raised 10 children. After the collapse of the USSR, some post-Soviet countries kept some version of it. Kazakhstan has 2, one for mothers of 10 children and one for mothers of 8 or 9. In Mongolia, the whole ceremony is very spectacular and kept every year in the central square under the statue of Genghis Khan and uses the Stalinist name, Orden Materinskaya Slava, or the Order of Maternal Glory. And it's awarded to mothers who give birth to 4 or more children. But that's not the only condition. It's not enough to have 4 kids, but you also have to, quote, ensure due care for their health, education, as well as physical, spiritual, and moral development in order to be eligible for this distinction. But it's not just the ex-Soviet or Soviet-influenced places. France also has Médaille de la Famille Française, established in 1920, and it's still awarded to this day, and whose conditions are very similar to the Mongolian program. All of these were part of previous pro-natalist programs and now remain as a legacy program because, well, times have changed. Being decorated by the state may have been a big thing in 1920, but today nobody cares. That's why post-Soviet Russia abolished it, but then Volodya had the idea of bringing it back in 2022. Now, how did that work? Well, the Russian citizens have spent more on contraceptives last year than basically ever in history. Revealed preferences show that people, at least the Russian people, are in fact disgusted at this policy rather than thrilled. However, the idea behind these decorations to offer status to parents is a good one, and it can work. But each society will have to figure out what does status means in their context. Basically, do what Putin couldn't figure out to do, namely that все имеет смысл в контексте. If it were up to me, I would definitely fund something like Parenthood Index, in which companies that don't intentionally offer bonuses and promotions to parents are penalized. Also, fiscal policy can do a lot here. Your company promotes parents? Okay, here's a nice tax cut. Your company doesn't have any parent in the leadership? Your tax bill just doubled. Just like that. And if you think this can't be done, you really need to read up more on what governance means. Fiscal policy to achieve social goals rather than money has been a thing for decades. It's just that right-wingers are afraid to use it. Still, employment-related status is a thing only with a few people outside of the United States. Believe it or not, it still is very weird, basically everywhere outside Scandinavia and the US, to derive your identity from your job. In most places, people still derive their identity from their families. So, in this context, there is room for policy. Give more status to larger families and start slow. This will require a very serious and honest study of the targeted society. You need to learn what young people value in terms of status and give them exactly that and way in excess of the average expectation. And the final cost for this, the financial one anyway, may not be too big actually. I mean, contrary to online wisdom, status is routinely cheap, monetarily speaking. Like for instance, PhD stands for poor, hopeless and desperate, financially speaking. But being called doctor carries a lot of status. One scheme I would toy with is one in which young people are incentivized to have kids first and then go to college. This makes sense. Peak fertility is not at 35, no matter what online idiots claim. Peak fertility is at 22 to 25. Meanwhile, peak wisdom is in fact later. So, a policy that aims to match these realities would bring a lot of things in order. You can go to college at 30. Heck, we may even pay for it in part. But only if you have 2 kids by age 30, or 3 by 35. That's the carrot. The stick is that childless people get 0 subsidies for college, maybe an exemption for the military. You may think this is radical, but really what I'm proposing is a version of Britain's already existent policy. Few subsidies, but there is also such thing as the Parents' Learning Allowance. Similar programs should exist for the majority that doesn't go to college. Friendly reminder to everyone, the majority of people anywhere don't go to college. So we could have partial or total tax exemption for every employee with children. 0 for 3 children, 70% deduction for 2, 50% for 1, and the 100% penalty, that is to say you pay twice as many taxes, for employees with 0 children. Here, some will say, but that's just a childlessness tax with extra steps. Well, yes, thank you for noticing. The United States has been having this in place since the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997, signed into law by President Bill Clinton. Hardly a far-righter, right? What do you think child tax credits are? So what I'm suggesting here is simply expanding on that. This policy hasn't been controversial at all in the last 27 years since it's been enacted, so it's a politically safe place to start from? Then what I'm saying here is that there isn't one status-inducing policy, it's all of them. And if you're into governance, you'll have to try as many of them as possible at once. Why? Because not everyone derives status from one thing, be it college, employment, or whatever. Of course, propaganda is on the table too, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Meanwhile, number 3, abortion and contraception. So let's just admit right off the bat that there is not a single country on earth where abortion is truly banned, shall we? Whatever example you may think of, I already know or can easily find 3 different ways to work around it, and also point out that the penalties are a joke. In fact, the fact that women who seek abortion are subjected to no penalty whatsoever means that abortion is not really banned. It's really that simple. If you believe abortion is murder, then it's hypocritical to then specifically prohibit the prosecution of the murderer, namely the mother. And by the way, that's the law in Texas. Also, if the punishment for those who perform abortion is not life in prison and the confiscation of all assets as the default, as the mandatory minimum, then abortion is not really banned. Now, is anyone willing to go there? No? Thought so. But here's the kicker. If the economic consequences of the population momentum ever get too serious, there will be governments who will go there, whether you like it or not. Besides, as a pro-natalist, your goal should be to have fewer abortions. Now, to be fair, there are other methods as well. For instance, there are a few countries in Europe, including my own, where abortion is de facto impossible. How? Well, by intentionally manipulating the pool of doctors through purposefully excluding those that do it and only keeping those that file conscientious objections. It's not a foolproof method, but, as we would say, it's good enough for government work. It's a good start. A model like in Poland can only work if the European Union doesn't exist. But ultimately, any serious pro-natalist will have to look for ways to restrict both abortion and most contraceptives. Now, with contraceptives, it's easier. Just slap a 5,000% VAT tax on them and make them prescription only, and then similarly with abortion, intentionally manipulate the pool of doctors in such a way that as few as possible are still around willing to prescribe. To ensure maximum compliance, introduce mandatory audits to all doctors with steep punishment for prescribing the wrong way. And if you think that's extreme, it's actually a lot less extreme than what the policy was when I was a kid. Remember, the policy doesn't have to even try to be foolproof. It just needs to move the needle a little bit. Currently, about half of those married and able to have children use contraception. That's the global number. In the Americas, Europe, China, Mongolia, and Russia, the proportion is way in excess of 80%. Any policy that reduces that should be called a success. Because remember, you need the consent of the governed. You'd be hard-pressed to get the consent of the governed too easily for a full ban on contraception. But a restriction here and there? You can easily sell it, especially with the majority old electorate who will, biologically speaking, not be affected. Yes, I am saying be cynical and appeal to the inherent selfishness of boomers. It always works. Trust the expert here. I've done this successfully more times than I can remember. Number 4, fertility-enhancing technologies and practices. So here I don't just refer to IVF, but also surrogacy and other practices. Conservative natalists will have to pick one. They're either pro-natalists and concerned with demographics, or they're conservative. If more babies matter that much to you, then surrogacy should not just be tolerated, but actively subsidized by the state and should also be streamlined. This would be one state policy that directly addresses the problem in a very tangible way. Again, if you believe this is a problem. Such a policy, however, is strongly opposed by religious conservatives. Oh well, count this as yet another issue that religious conservatives will necessarily lose. Similarly, progressive pro-natalists have to pick one. You can be pro-natalist and pro-abortion. It doesn't work out that way. Again, this is not my position. I'm natalist indifferent. But if your position is that more births matter the most, then these are policy decisions that are a no-brainer. IVF and surrogacy are only controversial with religious conservatives and basically nobody else. Limitless abortion matters only to the looniest postmodernist leftists and very little to everyone else. The pro-natalist position is to send both of these groups to pound sand. Now, of course, there are some complications, like for instance this case from New York, which seeks to establish legal precedent that gay men are ipso facto legally infertile. These people should also be told to pound sand. Real infertility deserves compassion, but infertility by virtue of chosen and easily changeable lifestyle, however, is most definitely not worthy of wasting resources on it. Number 5, propaganda and manufacturing consent. Come on, you all knew that it was coming. So, given that pro-natalists generally suck at propaganda, the only workaround is to use policy to compel or incentivize others to do it for you. Ideally, you should have overwhelmingly positive propaganda and little or no negative propaganda. Why? Well, because negative propaganda rarely works. Pro-natalists have been trying to shame childless people for decades. It just doesn't work. And I explained in the previous episodes why. Not only are most pro-natalists weird and repulsive, but their framing is also alien. So if you want effective propaganda, or at least less bad than the current model, you will want to incentivize positive messaging. And again, fiscal policy here is a great tool. For instance, almost every country on Earth has special provisions in its fiscal code for art. Whether it's tax-exempt, subsidized, has a lower VAT, or whatever. The legal framework to treat art as a special case already exists there. You don't have to innovate. All you have to do is tweak it. Does your art centralize a family with 3 or more children? Congratulations! It's tax-exempt for the entirety of its copyright validity, and here's $10,000 tax-free prize for it. Conversely, your art doesn't centralize family life and child rearing? Oh, that's so unfortunate. Your art has just been fiscally reclassified as gambling, or whatever fiscal category is in there for overly taxed vices. Oh, and an extra $20,000 fine because you have the wrong color of your cap. Your assets have been frozen effectively immediately until you pay the fine. Oh, but don't worry, we can waive the $20,000 fine if within a year you produce something that centralizes family life and child rearing. So what do you say, Mr. Independent Artist? And especially Mr. Big Art Studio? Now, of course, I'm being intentionally crude and intentionally an asshole here, but the idea is to use fiscal policy to incentivize the correct messaging and disincentivize everything else. And if you're about to say that this won't pass constitutional mustard, think again. In the United States, all it takes is 5 judges at SCOTUS to agree. That's really it. And in Europe, the framework for all of this is already there. If the European Commission can use public funds to fund LGBTQI art, and they've been doing that for 13 years, by the way, why exactly a national government can't do exactly the same, but for normative people? Because the lefties will cry about it? Who the fuck cares? But this goes beyond that. Institutions like the FTC or the National Audiovisual Councils in Europe could start to administratively penalize broadcasters who don't get on with the program. Internet service providers can be involved in a voluntary scheme that intentionally throttles anything that is not explicitly pro-family with many children in exchange for some sweet deals. I'm sure this terrifies you, but this is what being serious about using power looks like. And some of this may end up happening, though closer to 2050 rather than now. It will, of course, depend on how things evolve by then. The antinatalists have had no problem in using power to promote their propaganda and their message. So if you want to win, you should be willing to use power. If you're not willing to do that, then you're wasting your time and everyone else's time. Also on propaganda, the state should be the first to stop promoting childless people. Now, of course, this isn't immediately possible in reality, but there's no reason why a childless person should be permitted to run for office. Or, better put, there is no reason to assume that current eligibility conditions are some sort of a biblical unchangeable law. And I could go on like this for a while, but basically what I'm saying is flood the information space in a coordinated, intentional, and persistent way. So, not chaotically like with the pandemic project, and not infrequently like Denmark did, but persistently. And the initial goal will have to be to get the voluntary buy-in by as many subcultures as possible. In other words, don't be a boomer. How to get the buy-in of subcultures? Money, of course. How do you think the opposition did it? Exactly like that. There are tons of so-called influencers everywhere who are in fact either straight-up state actors or paid shills of a certain interest group. You'd be surprised how many people change their opinions when faced with the right amount of money. It's why I always say, to the shock of many activists, that I cannot guarantee I won't change my opinion for $10 million. I know I won't for $500,000 because I had the opportunity and said no. I want to believe I'll have the strength to say no to 10 million as well, but I can't guarantee. Now imagine most others who don't understand much about propaganda or governance. As cynical as this may sound, most people are in fact for sale, and if you don't buy them, someone else will. So there's that. Oh, one more thing about manufacturing consent. It's not a foolproof method, but it doesn't have to be. After all, the alphabet soup didn't get even half of what it wanted, but in the process, it sterilized at least 300,000 children in the United States alone. For the purposes of the Antinatalist project, the alphabet soup has been a success. Conversely, if you can convince 300,000 couples to have one more child, then for the purposes of the pro-natalist project, this would be a success in itself. Remember, inertia is a thing. No matter what policy or strategy you adopt, be prepared to wait years and up to 20 years to see the results. That's why I insist on persistence. This is a long march, not something that can be fixed with 10 laws and a few tweaks here and there. Number 6, social attitudes must change. Now, most pro-natalists ostensibly hold beliefs and ideas about society that are fundamentally incompatible with a high total fertility rate environment. This is likely due to the fact that, for now, most pro-natalists tend to be boomer conservatives. Mind you, boomer is a state of mind. I know 17-year-old boomers. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, a high TFR society does not look like Switzerland, which is a place with all the peace and quiet and, quite frankly, extreme boredom. A high TFR society looks like Kazakhstan, Israel, Cambodia, or Senegal, which is very energetic, rowdy, and yes, loud. Most boomer cons are ecstatic when they hear about the decline of nightlife, for instance, even though when mainstream society abandons nightlife, it doesn't just disappear. It's the control over it that shifts towards the criminal underworld, in the process thus making things even worse for everyone, but they don't know that. Well, in a high TFR environment, nightlife is not just in the cities, but in villages as well. I lived in such a world. In the 80s and 90s, as the children of the decree were growing up, discos and loud parties became very common even in small villages. This would be unthinkable today, but only because there simply aren't that many young people as they were 30 years ago. That would change again within a decade if the total fertility rate jumped from 1.8 to, let's say, 3. In a high TFR environment, violence is also more common, and the way to regulate that is to create release valves, so build more fight clubs, more stadiums, and more importantly, less insane rules. These are policies that just must go. You can't have words are violence standard in a high TFR environment. That's a standard for mollycoddled kids raised by very comfortable boomers for whom their only child is their universe. A high TFR environment necessarily means a lot less of such mollycoddling. Because ain't no one got times to deal with your petty shit when your younger siblings need their diapers changed. You know what I'm saying? This is a trade-off that must be acknowledged and embraced. Pro-natalists must make the case that this trade-off is totally worth it. Mind you, I do believe it's totally worth it, but for entirely different reasons. Mostly because I love the nightlife as part of the 30% of the population with a nocturnal circadian rhythm, and also because I continue to remain pretty youthful. And today, some 23-year-olds feel and act much older than me, and that is bad. But where did they learn that from? Well, not from me, that's for sure. But the broader point here is that, just like with status, fertility is driven by mood. A perfectly quiet society will never be in the mood to multiply at high fertility rates. It just won't happen. The compounding effect will make sure of that. Just like the same effect will make sure in the opposite direction once you get the ball rolling. It will keep on rolling for a decade or more. Remember, you are fighting a 200-year-old trend of decreasing fertility. To beat that, you just have to be willing to think outside the box. You can't hope to increase fertility by just throwing money at the problem. You have to convince the plebs that there is a problem to begin with. And as I was saying in the first chapter, that in itself is debatable. If your only argument is economic or materialist, well, what can I say? Good luck with that, you already lost. Oh, and speaking of social attitudes, I already mentioned this several times, but I'll mention it again. In Central Asia, the way they maintain a high fertility rate is by youngsters having children early. By 24, they're done with this problem. And they pursue other goals later on, while the kids are raised by babushka until age 5 or 7 or sometimes even later. Could this be replicated in the West? Well, not with the current generation of babushkas. I mean, what I read from American boomers online is horrifying. The average American boomer holds ideas that are extreme even to European liberals. The average American boomer is structurally antinatalist. I don't know how to fix that, but I do know that those people in Central Asia do have a point, as evidenced by reality. Number 7. Pointed initiatives as opposed to large-scale initiatives. Now, this is something that could definitely work and in fact can be done by anyone truly serious about this. Helping somebody who has 4 kids but wants 8 is more important than helping someone who has none but wants 1, said Malcolm Collins, the founder of the pro-natalist.org, to Politico in an article that tries really hard to smear him as evil. Now, to be honest, I can respect the guy. He and his wife have 4 kids and they're both entrepreneurs. They're also weird techies, which makes them quite unlikable to me, but be that as it may, their idea is not just respectable and legitimate, but doable, and doable today. And unlike other pro-natalist LARPers, they have already put their money where their mouth is. So from that perspective, the pro-natalists would benefit a lot from having more of Malcolm and Collins speaking in their name rather than Elon Musk. In fact, if Elon Musk is so smart, he'd take the initiative in promoting these people. But hey, what do I know? Still, their idea is actionable today with private funds and makes an immediate difference today. After all, it's not exactly different to how things worked 100 or 200 or 500 years ago. Again, 500 years ago, the average household had 4.75 people or even a little below. Which means that, contrary to popular misconceptions, having 10 kids around the house wasn't exactly common, and the average was lifted up by the extreme exceptions who did have 10. Well, now we have the technology and the conditions to replicate that in a way our ancestors couldn't even begin to dream. So, from both a policy and private activism perspective, this should be on every pro-natalist's radar. So, there's that. Number 8. Education. Well, this one is simple. State education is an indoctrination system, and it's not ideologically neutral, and it never has been. The very idea that state education can be neutral is insane and is one of those gaslighting positions that the plebs have swallowed, mostly for convenience. Still, since it exists, there is no rule that says it cannot be changed. So drop the compulsory requirements. There is no rational reason for why kids should be in an institution for a mandatory of 15 years like in France. That is torture. Get back to saner standards. Let the kids live so they grow up loving life. Because if they do, well, they're more likely than not later on to want kids of their own. It's really simple. Of the few compulsory instruction period that may or may not remain, try to reform that one in accordance with the agenda. Replace sex ed with family education. This would piss off both the left and the right. The left won't like it because it de-emphasizes hedonism, while the right, in some places, won't like it because it bulldozes away the idea of abstinence only. Again, if we want more births, the last thing we need to do is teach contraception in schools. That's in no way acceptable. But again, in this case, pro-natalists will have to put up their big boy pants and big girl skirts and start working on a curriculum that emphasizes family formation and upkeep. It's doable, trust me. If the Romanian communists were able to do it in their context, it's doable now as well. It will also have to be, well, sexist, because mothers and fathers are not interchangeable. I know, it's hard, but governance is not easy. Number 9 and final. Constant re-evaluation. As I was saying, there is no one policy or one set of policies and you're done. No. In fact, on propaganda, you have to constantly re-evaluate every 6 months or sometimes even faster and adjust to the changing realities. But the same goes to other policies as well. If a policy turns out to be too extreme and you're losing the consent of the governed, you dial it down. Or the opposite, if a policy turns out to be an easy hurdle to go through, or even worse, go around, you tighten the screw of it even more. On education, you evaluate every 5 years or so. Let's say graduation is on average at age 15. Again, reducing school time and compressing the school work is part of the package. Well, you look at when that generation is 20 or 22. Is their total fertility rate higher than the previous generations who are not under this program? If yes, find out what convinced them and what they hated. If not, find out why not and readjust. It's a fine balance. Governance is not easy. That's why so many establishmentarian leftists are successful when they mock non-leftists by saying, "You can't govern." Well, it's oftentimes true. So many non-leftists are legit afraid to govern. Well, don't complain that the left is eating your lunch if you haven't even tried to take a bite. Ultimately, the policy that actually stands a chance of working is just as complicated as the subject matter itself, and it doesn't fit neatly into a tweet or a Twitter thread or a TikTok video. So, if pro-natalists are serious, well, for the most part, they're failing at showing it. Alright, Chapter 4, Conclusions. Real quick. I will definitely remember something while editing this series that probably should have been included in the series. So, even though this series is long, I am under no illusion that I have exhausted the topic. However, I already delved into it more and more seriously than most of the pro-natalist content out there, and did it without being a pro-natalist myself. I'm fine with either outcome, quite frankly. I lived in high fertility countries and low fertility countries. There's nice trade-offs in both of them for someone like me. I genuinely don't have a dog in this race. However, one thing is certain. I will henceforth be less tolerant with pro-natalist LARPing. Pro-natalists have to get out from their doomerist paradigm and use that energy into devising practical trade-offs that can be enacted starting with themselves, quite frankly. You can't come at me or society in general preaching all doom and gloom about fertility rates while you yourself haven't put your money where your mouth is. So, ultimately, fertility and demographics is really not that simple. And whoever tells you it's simple and it has a solution that fits into a tweet or a 3-minute video, that person either has no idea what he's talking about or is trying to sell you something. I'm not selling you anything here. As I said, I'm fine with either result. Even on the long run, in fact. Fertility has fixed itself multiple times throughout history, and routinely better times came out from a demographic winter. I will trust the natural regulation mechanism to do the job this time as well on a macro level. Meanwhile, on an individual level, I'll continue to be a fan of policies and attitudes that don't explicitly fuck over young people, such as anti-human car-centric cities, puritanist nonsense, or mollycoddling that stunt young people's social lives. And with that, I will stop here. Thank you all for watching. If you actually managed to get this far, don't forget to subscribe, and if you like these kinds of things, do consider a donation and send me to the cartels. I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.